And Iran has responded to Israel's Operation Rising Lion with retaliatory strikes. Explosions were heard in Jerusalem and Tel Aviv. Missiles were seen over Tel Aviv's skyline. Israeli military said Iran had fired 2 salvos. The IDF said that Iran fired fewer than 100 missiles, most of which were intercepted. Israeli media said that 44 people have been injured. Meanwhile, 2 U.S. officials also said that the U.S. military helped shoot down Iranian missiles that were headed for Israel. This is the latest that we're getting. Iran has responded to Israel's Operation Rising Lion with retaliatory strikes. Explosions were heard in Jerusalem as well as Tel Aviv. Missiles were seen over Tel Aviv's skyline. The Israeli military said that Iran had fired 2 salvos. The IDF said that Iran fired fewer than 100 missiles, most of which were intercepted or maybe fell short. Israeli media said that 44 people have been injured. Meanwhile, 2 U.S. officials also said that the U.S. military did help shoot down Iranian missiles that were headed for Israel. This is the latest that we're getting at the moment, and for all our viewers who may be just joining in, let me just quickly bring you up to speed with all that has transpired since the 13th of June yesterday. That was a Friday. Israel had struck Iran, and Iranian media said explosions were heard in Tehran. This is tensions mounted over U.S. efforts to win Iran's agreement to halt production of material for atomic bomb. Now, Israeli statements coming out had said that Iran was going to reach a point of no return with regards to its nuclear program, which is why these preemptive strikes were carried out. Israel has also declared a state of emergency. Of course, this was in anticipation to the strikes. As we know now, and you can see on your screens, there have been strikes by Iran that have been carried out over Jerusalem and Tel Aviv. All right, for more on this, we're being joined live by Professor James A. Russell from Washington, D.C. He is an associate professor in the Department of National Security Affairs and expert on U.S. foreign policy. Thank you so much for joining us this morning. Of course, I'm sure you're up to speed with what's happening. What I want to ask you is, of course, we do know that we had that statement by 2 U.S. officials who did say that the U.S. military has helped shoot down Iranian missiles that were headed for Israel. Once again, what this does is bring into question the extent and scope of the United States' involvement. We do know that in the statement earlier yesterday, they had said that the U.S. was not militarily involved in these attacks, even though it did have prior information. What's your assessment of this?
My assessment is that this escalation and the response by the Iranians is something that the Israelis have planned for. And the purpose of this operation was to get the United States involved more deeply. And I would say that it appears as if President Trump has fallen into the trap that Benjamin Netanyahu has been attempting to set for most of his predecessors, which is to involve the United States in a wider war against Iran. And I think it's clear the Jerusalem Post, for example, reported cooperation and collusion between the United States and Israel prior to the attack. And I think the United States has taken the bait from President Netanyahu, hook, line, and sinker. And I wish I could say I thought that there were adults in charge on the American side to stop the escalation, but I don't see that.
All right, so you say that Donald Trump has perhaps fallen for Netanyahu's trap here. And that being said, given the scale and precision of Israel's preemptive strikes as well, what larger message do you think it's hoping to send here, not just to Iran, but perhaps even regional powers and Western allies? Because we were speaking to some of the experts yesterday as well, and my question to them was whether we can call it an all-out war. Of course, this was in the initial hours of Friday morning. Some of them did say that this is not, we could call it an all-out war, but not a war that started on the 13th, but one that has continued since the 7th of October. Do you assess that to be true?
Oh, there's no question that Israel and Iran have been in an undeclared war for, the last 10, 15 odd years. And it broke out into a more open exchange of fire, certainly over the last 6 to 9 months in the Gaza war and the Israeli operations against Hezbollah. So, yeah, it's fair to say that the Exchange of fire today is simply a continuation of that, except with one important distinction. It's the Israelis that have chosen to escalate dramatically in the attacks upon Iran's nuclear sites, with, again, this attempt to draw the United States into war. Israel cannot destroy Iran's nuclear capabilities with standoff strikes. The program cannot be bombed out of existence. This was the essential judgment of the Obama administration, of course, and was a reason why it sought to reach an agreement with the Iranians. So it's a fool's errand. Israel's engaged in a fool's errand here. It cannot bomb the Iranian program out of existence. It doesn't have the capabilities to sustain the kind of bombardment that we're seeing here. The calculation on the part of Netanyahu and the Israelis is to hand off the ball to the United States and get the United States involved in a much more offensive way. And we see in this latest round of attacks the dependence of the Israelis on the United States to defend it. Israel can't defend itself by itself against the Iranians, which is again another attempt to simply draw in the United States much more forcefully into the conflict. Because, as I said, this has been an objective of Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu for the last quarter-odd century, which is to have a wider war with the Iranians, but have the United States do the fighting. The United States has had a series of presidents that have resisted this pressure. And I think we are seeing in current circumstance that right now we do not have an American president in place who is willing to resist this pressure. Pressure not just by Netanyahu, but by the Israeli lobby in Washington, D.C., which owns the American Congress. There isn't any question about this.
All right, now I'm also glad that you mentioned this, because I was just going to come to this. Just to expand on that further, what long-term strategic calculus then might Israel be pursuing with this direct strike inside Iranian territory? And of course, I'm talking about the preemptive strikes, of course, beyond immediate retaliation or deterrence.
Mm-hmm. The objective, I think, and again, your question is the right question, of course, and it's the question that goes to the heart of all matters of conflict in international relations, which is the attempt to unpack the motivations of the antagonists. And of course, this is difficult. Scholars write books about this. They write articles. It's difficult to sort of come to this. But I think in the case of Israel, if I'm just making an educated guess here, and that's all it is, it's just an educated guess, it's the embrace of the Zionist expansionist ideology, which is to expand its territory through the force of arms, slaughtering the Palestinians as they have been for the last year to expand their territory, start a war with the Iranians, with, again, pulling in the United States to have this sort of continuous conflict around them at all times, with, in the case of the Iranians, the attempt to get the United States to do most of the heavy lifting. The United States has tens of thousands of troops deployed in the Gulf region, and of course what Israel would like, of course, is for the United States to take on the responsibility, for example, in this particular series of operations, the takedown of Natanz and Fordo, which are two of the most important sites in the Iran nuclear program, both of which the Iranians have put underground by hundreds of feet, at least according to some estimates. Israel can't destroy these sites, and the hope is that the United States would then take on the mission of doing so. And it's a fool's errand. I don't care who's dropping the bombs. The Iranian program cannot be bombed out of existence, and that's just the bottom line. And it's why a diplomatic solution is the only rational solution, unless, in the case of Netanyahu, you're seeking to have a war for your own ideological and political purposes. And the mystery of this is Donald Trump, of course, who campaigned in the presidential campaign as a president that was going to end these wars. And instead, what we are seeing is an expansion of these wars. So these are two of the things I think that are at play here.
I hear you. In fact, we did, of course, hear the reports of Israel striking the Natanz facility as well. And upon speaking to some of the experts from Tehran, we did understand that these are deeply underground facilities, and
Yeah.
Israel only barely managed to scratch the surface. So clearly,
Yes.
deterrence, if that was the aim, it wasn't achieved. That's one of the objectives that they say was the reason why they carried out Operation Rising Lion. That being said, of course, we heard Donald Trump say that he hopes that Iran will come back to the negotiating table and talks will carry out as were planned for Sunday in Muscat. Do you think
Yeah.
that's just wishful thinking at this point? Because it doesn't seem like that's going to happen.
Of course, I don't know why Iran would hold or take the word of the United States in any negotiation. It's clear that it appears clear, at least, that the United States was using the negotiations as a ploy to give the Iranians a false sense of security, and that the United States was, of course, aiding and abetting the Israeli planning for the strikes. So the United States has no credibility left in any of the negotiating forums. If I was a foreign country, I wouldn't be entering any negotiations with the United States. We've shown ourselves to be completely untrustworthy, I think as you said, I think it's a pipe dream to expect that the Iranians would come back to the negotiating table and say, "Oh, we understand now, and now we're really ready to talk about serious, sort of terms of agreement." The fact is that there was actually a framework for a deal in place. It was the same framework that the Obama administration put into place, which was that there were going to be some limitations on Iranian enrichment. And Iran appeared as if, they would accept some limitations and that they would reduce the stockpile of uranium that they had enriched to 60%. But of course, it appears now that the United States was being completely disingenuous in all of this. And as I say, I just can't imagine any foreign power, let alone the Iranians, wanting to go back to a negotiating table with the United States at this point in time. Just my
Right.
opinion.
Right. So would you say then perhaps the United States at this point is also going through a bit of a messaging problem, because we do know on the surface they are trying to distance themselves from what's happening and the strikes that were carried out by Israel as much as possible?
I don't see how the United States can distance itself from this in any way, shape, or form. The reality of the situation is that the United States is being led around by the nose by the Israelis. This was the case in the Biden administration, in which it was Benjamin Netanyahu and the Israeli lobby in Washington, D.C. that were dictating American policy. I think, and this is another case in which, again, Netanyahu and the Israeli lobby are dictating American policy. President Trump is not standing up and implementing a foreign policy that suits American interests. These strikes don't support American interests in any way, shape, or form. Iran is not a national security threat to the United States, and yet the threat industry in Washington, D.C., in the think tank communities, pumps out this propaganda pieces about what a serious threat Iran is. And this has clouded America's strategic thinking, or the lack of strategic thinking, I would just, in my opinion. So this is a terrible state of affairs. I would draw a comparison to India's latest face-off against Pakistan, in which adult judgment on both sides of the aisle, so to speak, prevailed. The shooting stopped. They got things back under control. And some of the parties that had acted irresponsibly stopped. So this is what's called for in this circumstance, obviously, when you're striking these nuclear sites, and yet we have no adult supervision on the American and Israeli side whatsoever. If anything, it's the Iranians, of course. And why would they come to the negotiating table? The lesson that they would draw from this interaction is that, would any of this happen if they'd had their own nuclear weapons? I mean, all Israel is doing is ensuring that the very outcome that they're seeking to avoid, right, which is an Iran nuclear weapons program, is going to come into existence. So it's again an exercise in futility.
All right, and that's interesting because you're right, because that's what Israel said, that Iran was perhaps, as per the intelligence that they had gathered, that Iran was perhaps going to reach a point of no return when it comes to their nuclear program, which is why Operation Rising Lion was carried out and which is why we saw those preemptive strikes. That being said, how might this moment mark a shift in the doctrine of preemptive defense in the Middle East? And of course, I'm sure you know, does it signal a breakdown of the traditional, what we call in international relations, the red line deterrence model? Do you think that's happening here?
Oh, I don't think there can be any question about this, that Israel is effectively a rogue state in the international system today, and none of the surrounding states in the Middle East today can be in any way secure that one day that Israel's American-provided equipment is going to be appearing over its national borders, doing whatever they like to something that they don't want to see happen. In other words, it creates a whole, sort of a dangerous system where there can be no trust, between any of the regional states, particularly about the Israelis who have shown themselves to be untrustworthy, trigger happy. They're engaging in a genocidal war now against the Palestinians, and they're completely off the reservation in terms of international law, although it has to be said that the United States has blazed the trail here on international law. The United States has played a leading role over the last quarter century in the shredding of international law, which is supposed to govern and prevent and ameliorate the use of force by states against one another. We have been we've played a leading role in this, and the Israelis are just plowing right on through this, whatever restraints might have existed on them. And the states, like, for example, in Turkey, for example, they would have to set up and take notice of this, that the Israelis are simply just a trigger-happy bunch, willing to kill innocent civilians, as many of them as they think necessary. They're willing to reach out and bomb foreign surrounding states. It's a terrible state of affairs. One, I might add, that simply guarantees that, as I said, from the Zionist ideological sort of perspective, simply guarantees that the war continues, which is what their ideology supports and what they want to see. They want to have this sort of continual conflict, and they're not interested in peaceful negotiations to achieve stability and security. It's a continuous warlike existence, which is a terrible thing for our country, and it's a terrible thing for the region, and it's a terrible thing for the United States to be so closely joined to Israel in this, because we are getting dragged down into this whole mess.
Right, I hear you. And of course, as you mentioned, that this is just a continuous state of war, which is further being perpetuated by Israel and the actions that it carries out, of course. And we did hear Netanyahu very blatantly say as well that we'll continue this for as long as we need to. Now, of course, the very obvious question there would be, to what end? And also, I wanted to understand, just on that note, what implications does this escalation have for the future of nuclear diplomacy, not just with Iran, but just generally?
Yeah. Well, of course, from the American perspective, an historic objective of the United States throughout the post-World War II period has been to preserve and strengthen the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. And this is the essential dividing line in the international system, of course, between the nuclear and non-nuclear states. And what we are seeing here is Israel, which is not a signatory to the Non-Proliferation Treaty, taking it upon themselves to police a party that has signed the treaty. And of course, that essentially takes us into the wild, wild west, if you will, a place in a metaphorical sense, means that violence can occur at any moment in time, in any kind of circumstance. It's behavior that's not being regulated and controlled by the sort of norms of international behavior. And it creates the specter, again, of widespread, again, violence, for states who even suspect a country may be approaching the nuclear threshold. And there's not a happy ending to this story. And I have to say that it appears as if, again, the United States is all but abandoning its commitment to the non-proliferation treaty and to, again, the structure of the international system, which has divided the system into nuclear and non-nuclear states. Iran has not reached the nuclear threshold in terms of becoming, obviously, a nuclear weapon state, and appeared open to the idea of negotiation and compromise after the agreement that the United States and Donald Trump pulled out of, which was limiting their program. So all this does is guarantee that again, that I hope it doesn't guarantee, but if I was in Tehran, what are you supposed to say? What are you supposed to think about something like this? That there's no interest in them anymore in abiding by the rules. They look at North Korea, for example, which broke out of the non-proliferation treaty, armed itself with nuclear weapons, and are they being harassed? Have they been harassed like this? People have left them alone. And so this leads them, as I said in my last remarks about this, to the inescapable conclusion that if they're going to protect themselves, and as you quite correctly note in your comments, to reestablish deterrence, they have to sort of figure that they've got to get their own weapon. And this is not a problem for the Iranians. They've got trained people, they've got money, they've got a source of uranium to enrich, they've got money, they've got all the essential ingredients, and it's a big country. There's no way that the nuclear program of Iran can be bombed out of existence. It's an impossibility. It can't happen. And it just encourages them to dig a little deeper in terms of places like Natanz and Fordo and their deception, denial, and hiding systems. And so, again, this simply creates another circumstance where the nuclear non-proliferation treaty is shredded, and it changes the calculations of other states around the world that are also looking at this with a much sort of darker and less stable and secure future.
Right. So the only option right now is to take a step back and perhaps return to the path of diplomacy.
This was the path that we were on, and it's just, we should never have strayed from it. And the United States should not have allowed the Israelis to drag us back into this violent exchange, which is effectively what's happened.
All right, Professor Russell, thank you so much for joining us on WION World is One with your insights on this. It's always a pleasure to have you with us.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it.
For latest news, download the WION app and subscribe to our YouTube channel.